Imagine waking up one morning, turning on your PC, and realizing that the operating system you've used for decades is no longer what it used to be. The familiar Windows logo is still there. The Start button still glows in the corner, but under the surface something fundamental has changed. The core is no longer purely Windows. It is Linux. Not in the experimental, optional way we saw with the Windows Subsystem for Linux. Not as a developer, a Don buried in settings, but as a fully integrated Linux mode that reshapes how the system boots, runs applications, handles security, and connects to the cloud. And here's the wild part. This move, designed to save Windows, could be the very thing that finally makes it irrelevant. For decades, Microsoft built its empire on Windows. From Windows 95 to Windows XP, from Windows 7 to Windows 10 and 11, the company dominated personal computing. Businesses standardized on it. Gamers depended on it. Enterprises locked their infrastructure into it. Even when competitors like macOS and Linux carved out loyal audiences, Windows remained the default. It was not just an operating system, it was the platform. Software was written for it first. Hardware was designed around it. The entire PC ecosystem revolved around Windows. But times changed. The rise of cloud computing shifted power away from the local machine. Web apps replaced desktop apps. Smartphones became the primary computing device for billions of people. And in this new world, Windows wasn't automatically the center anymore. Meanwhile, Linux quietly took over the servers powering the internet, the infrastructure behind cloud giants, the backbone of Android, and even development environments for startups and tech giants alike. Linux wasn't flashy, but it was everywhere. Microsoft saw this shift long before most users did. Under Satya Nadella's leadership, the company pivoted hard toward cloud services. Azure became a top priority. Office turned into Microsoft 365. Subscriptions replaced one-time licenses. And in a move that would have seemed impossible in the 1990s, Microsoft embraced Linux. They joined the Linux Foundation. They contributed code to open-source projects. Azure began running more Linux workloads than Windows. The message was clear. The future was not about protecting Windows at all costs. It was about staying relevant in a world that increasingly preferred open systems. At first, Microsoft's Linux integration was cautious. Windows Subsystem for Linux allowed developers to run Linux distributions inside Windows without a virtual machine. It was a powerful tool, but it still positioned Windows as the host. Linux was a guest, a helper, a feature. But imagine a scenario where Microsoft goes further. They introduce a true Linux mode, not just a compatibility layer, but a core architecture shift where the Windows kernel is replaced or deeply merged with the Linux kernel. Windows becomes more of a user interface and application layer, sitting on top of Linux foundations. For developers, this would be revolutionary. Instead of juggling between Windows and Linux environments, they would have native compatibility. Containers, Docker, Kubernetes, and modern DevOps pipelines would feel natural, not bolted on. Performance overhead would shrink. The friction that once pushed developers to macOS or pure Linux machines would vanish. Suddenly, the best of both worlds promise might actually be real. But here's where things get complicated. If Windows can run on Linux seamlessly, and Linux can run Windows applications through compatibility layers like Wine or Proton, what exactly makes Windows essential anymore? If the underlying engine is Linux, and most applications are web-based anyway, the Windows brand risks becoming a skin, a theme, a legacy compatibility environment. Users might begin to ask, why not just use Linux directly? Consider gaming, one of Windows' last strongholds. For years, gamers stayed loyal because of DirectX and exclusive compatibility. But Valve invested heavily in Proton, enabling Windows games to run on Linux with impressive performance. The Steam Deck proved that Linux could handle mainstream gaming. If Microsoft shifts to Linux mode, developers might start targeting cross-platform graphics APIs by default. DirectX could become less central. Over time, the gap between gaming on Windows and gaming on Linux would shrink to near zero. Security is another angle. Linux has long enjoyed a reputation for robust security architecture and transparent open-source auditing. If Windows adopts a Linux core, Microsoft could market it as a security revolution. Fewer legacy vulnerabilities, faster patch cycles, a modern permission model. Enterprises might love it, but paradoxically, this move could expose how much of traditional Windows complexity was self-inflicted. If Linux underpins everything, then the old reasons for sticking with Windows Server or Enterprise Windows editions might weaken. There is also the psychological factor. For decades, Windows and Linux represented opposing philosophies. Windows was proprietary, centralized, controlled by Microsoft. Linux was open, community-driven, decentralized. By merging with Linux, Microsoft blurs that line. Some users will celebrate this as unity, others will see it as surrender. And once that wall falls, the mystique of Windows as a distinct ecosystem fades. Think about education. Many universities already teach programming using Linux environments. If Windows machines effectively become Linux machines underneath, students will realize they are already using Linux. That awareness alone could shift perceptions. The barrier to switching disappears. Instead of learning Linux later, new generations might grow up seeing Linux as normal and Windows as optional. Corporate IT departments might initially resist such a drastic change. Legacy software built around Windows APIs could break or require emulation layers. But Microsoft has immense resources. They could create compatibility frameworks so advanced that most users never notice the difference. Over time, those legacy systems would be phased out. Cloud-based enterprise software would dominate. Once everything important runs in a browser or container, the operating system beneath becomes less critical. And that's the core issue. A Linux mode could accelerate the commoditization of the operating system. If Windows becomes just one distribution among many, with a custom interface and subscription services layered on top, then its competitive moat shrinks. The more Microsoft aligns with open standards, the less lock-in it maintains. There is also an economic dimension. Microsoft earns significant revenue from enterprise Windows licenses. If Linux mode reduces differentiation, competitors could offer similar Linux-based systems without licensing fees. Enterprises might evaluate cost savings. Governments pushing for open-source adoption could use this as justification to migrate fully away from proprietary ecosystems. On the other hand, Microsoft might anticipate this and pivot further. Windows could evolve into a service layer tightly integrated with Azure. Linux mode would simply ensure compatibility and performance, while real value comes from cloud synchronization, AI assistance, and subscription features. In that scenario, Windows, as a standalone product, becomes less important than the ecosystem it connects to. Artificial intelligence complicates the picture even more. AI development overwhelmingly happens on Linux. Training models, running inference servers, deploying containers, Linux dominates. If Microsoft wants Windows to be an AI-first platform, adopting Linux internally makes strategic sense. But again, this reinforces Linux's position as the foundation of modern computing. So could Linux mode kill Windows? Not overnight. Not in the dramatic sense of disappearing logos and shut down servers. Instead, it could be a slow transformation where Windows dissolves into something else, a brand without a unique core, a compatibility layer rather than a dominant platform. Ironically, this would mirror what happened to Internet Explorer. Once dominant, it faded as web standards advanced and alternatives thrived. Microsoft eventually replaced it with Edge, built on Chromium, an open-source project initiated by Google. In doing so, they abandoned their own rendering engine. The same pattern could repeat at the operating system level. From a user perspective, many might not care. If their apps work, their files sync, and their games run smoothly, the underlying kernel is invisible. But for the tech industry, this shift would be monumental. It would signal that even the most powerful proprietary operating system could not resist the gravitational pull of open-source ecosystems. There's also cultural symbolism. Windows was once seen as the embodiment of mainstream computing. Linux was the hacker's playground. If Microsoft officially embraces a Linux core, it validates decades of open-source advocacy. It confirms that collaborative development can outlast corporate dominance. And yet, Microsoft could spin this as innovation rather than capitulation. They might present Linux mode as evolution, as the natural convergence of the best technologies. Marketing would emphasize performance, flexibility, and cross-platform harmony. The average consumer might simply see faster boot times and better battery life. But power dynamics would shift subtly. Developers would gain more leverage. Open-source communities would gain influence. The narrative that Windows is required would weaken. Choice would expand. In the long run, the real question isn't whether Linux mode kills Windows, but whether Windows needs to survive in its old form at all. Perhaps Microsoft understands that clinging to a 1990s model is futile. Perhaps they see the writing on the wall. Operating systems are becoming interchangeable foundations beneath cloud services and AI platforms. If that's true, Linux mode is less a feature and more a transition strategy. A bridge from the era of desktop dominance to the era of distributed computing. But every bridge implies leaving something behind. And what might be left behind is the very identity that made Windows iconic. In that sense, Linux mode could finally kill Windows, not through competition, but through transformation. Not by defeating it, but by absorbing it into a broader ecosystem where the name matters less than the services attached to it. The irony is profound. The company that once called Linux a threat could end up relying on it as the backbone of its flagship product. The rivalry that defined an era would dissolve into partnership, and in that dissolution, Windows as we knew it might quietly fade away. The logo may remain. The Start menu may still pop up in the corner of the screen, but underneath, the line will have been crossed. And once crossed, there may be no going back.